Phoebe Carter stood frozen at the cellar door, gripping the heavy iron key as muffled screams rose from the darkness below. Outside, thunder rolled through Charleston, shaking the foundation of the grand house on Meeting Street. She knew she had crossed a line that could never be undone, an act that would haunt the city's whispered legends for generations. Within moments, she would disappear into the raging storm, leaving behind only her headscarf tied to that key and a mystery that no one would ever solve. But how could a woman with no freedom and nothing to her name vanish so completely that even her ghost seemed afraid to return? 3 years before that fateful night in 1842, Phoebe had arrived at the Green household on a sweltering August afternoon. She'd been bought at the slave market on Chalmers Street for $800, a steep price, reflecting her skill as a house servant. Nathaniel Green, a wealthy cotton merchant with plantations across the Low Country, needed someone capable to restore order to his Charleston townhouse after his wife's death left it in chaos. Phoebe arrived with only a spare dress, a wooden comb, and a tattered Bible she couldn't read, but carried like a talisman. She was 26, tall, composed with sharp, watchful eyes that missed nothing. Her previous owner in Virginia had died bankrupt, and she'd been sold along with 23 others torn from her family, her mother's sisters and brother, scattered across the South like dust in the wind. Nathaniel Green, a man nearing 50, was respected, but feared. His cruelty wasn't loud or public. It was quiet and deliberate, hidden beneath a gentleman's calm exterior. He studied Phoebe like a specimen, how she worked, how she moved, how her silence carried dignity instead of submission. The house itself was a symbol of wealth and ghosts. 3 stories of Charleston gray brick built in 1793 by enslaved craftsmen whose names had been forgotten. The cellar, though, was unlike any other. It stretched beneath the entire house, vast and cold, lined with wine racks and food stores and darker things too. Iron chains on the wall, a whipping post half concealed behind crates, a barred cell that Nathaniel claimed was once used for prisoners of war. The cellar door was reinforced with iron and locked by a key so heavy it felt like an anchor in the hand. Nathaniel would hand it to Phoebe when he needed wine and watch her return it each time. Once he asked her softly if she'd ever wondered what it would feel like to be trapped down there. The question lingered in her mind like a curse. 3 months after her arrival, Phoebe met Marcus, a coachman from the Rutledge estate next door. He was strong, kind, and carried himself with quiet defiance. They spoke cautiously at first. In brief, stolen moments, each word a risk. Over time, their conversations deepened, and so did their bond. Marcus shared stories of loss, his mother, his wife, the daughter he'd never met. Phoebe told him of her own family, her brother's songs in the tobacco fields, her mother's stained hands, and the words she'd whispered at the auction block. Remember who you are. But their fragile happiness darkened when Marcus noticed Nathaniel's gaze lingering too long on Phoebe. The master's voice turned soft and possessive. He began calling for her more often, insisting she serve his wine, creating excuses to summon her alone. Marcus warned her to be careful. Phoebe didn't need the warning. She already felt the danger closing in slow as the tide, but impossible to escape. When winter came, it hit Charleston harder than anyone remembered. Frost rimmed the cobblestones, fires burned all day, and Nathaniel's temper worsened with the cold. He drank more, raged more, and Phoebe began to plan. Quietly, methodically, she studied the house. She learned its sounds, its secrets, and how to move unseen. She memorized the cellar, every shadow and crevice. She imagined what freedom might cost and what she was willing to pay. One night, Nathaniel called her to his study. He was alone, his voice unusually gentle. He spoke of her loneliness, of family, of how he might buy one of her sisters and bring her to Charleston. His tone was syrup sweet, but full of poison. Phoebe stood still, heart pounding, understanding exactly what he was offering and what he meant to take. Nathaniel said it would cost him more than $1,000 to bring Phoebe's sister to Charleston, but he was willing to make that investment. He let the words hang in the air, like smoke, his meaning unmistakable. Phoebe understood perfectly her gratitude would be expected, her compliance assured. Her sister's fate would depend entirely on what Phoebe was willing to give. She stood motionless, her face calm and unreadable, while inside her mind raced. She knew this was a lie, a cruel manipulation dressed up as kindness. Even if he did buy her sister, it would only mean another life chained to his control. Gratitude would become debt, and debt would become ownership. The only freedom Nathaniel Green offered was the illusion of it. Phoebe thanked him, softly, told him she was grateful for his generosity, and kept her voice steady, even as rage burned beneath the surface. He smiled, pleased by her submission, and waved her away, like a man dismissing a servant who had done her duty. That night, she didn't sleep. Lying awake in the attic room she shared with two others, she stared into the darkness and felt something harden inside her. The fear that had ruled her life was still there, sharp as ever, but now it shared space with a new fire, a refusal. She remembered her mother's last words, "Remember who you are." And for the first time, she truly understood them. She was not property. She was Phoebe Carter, and she would not let Nathaniel Green destroy her. At first light, she found Marcus in the stables next door, brushing down the Rutledge horses. She brought a basket of kitchen scraps as a cover and slipped inside quietly. When she told him what Nathaniel had said, his jaw tightened, fury and helplessness flickering in his eyes. He wanted to tell her to run, to flee north and vanish. But they both knew how that story usually ended. Runaways were hunted down, beaten, mutilated, or worse. And even those who reached freedom lived like ghosts, never safe, never still, always one betrayal away from being dragged back. They stood close, whispering in the dim light, holding each other's hands like it might be the last time. Marcus said he wished he could protect her, wished the world were different. Phoebe told him that his care was enough, that in another life they might have had something real. When she returned to the house, everything around her felt muted and distant. The days blurred together, full of noise and routine, but her mind stayed focused. February came with rain and warmer air, turning Charleston streets to mud and filling the air with damp salt and smoke. The greenhouse came alive again, with parties and polished silver guests laughing around the long dining table while Phoebe poured their wine. She moved silently through the room, her expression neutral, listening as the men talked about politics, profits, and the nation's growing divide over slavery. They spoke freely, unaware that she understood every word. To them, she was invisible, just another servant in the background. But Phoebe was listening, learning. One night, a guest named William Blackwood joined Nathaniel's dinner. A lawyer by trade, he was known for his charm in court and his brutality at home. Among the enslaved, his name was spoken in fear. 2 women from his household had vanished under suspicious circumstances. He spent the evening watching Phoebe, his gaze bold and invasive. When he finally asked Nathaniel where he had acquired such a fine servant, Nathaniel answered proudly, even boasting about the price he'd paid. Blackwood offered to buy her. Nathaniel laughed and refused, saying she was far too valuable to sell. The other men joined in his laughter, the sound hollow and cruel. Phoebe kept her composure, but she memorized every detail, their names, their faces, the way they spoke, as if human lives were nothing more than property to trade. After the guests left and the house fell quiet, Nathaniel called Phoebe to his study. She knew what was coming. He stood by the window, brandy in hand, his voice smooth and self-satisfied. He said Blackwood's interest had reminded him of her worth, that men would pay handsomely for someone like her, but that he had no plans to sell her. "You belong here," he told her. "I have plans for you." Then he stepped closer. his breath heavy with alcohol, and brushed his fingers against her face. She forced herself not to flinch, not to react at all. She thanked him again, her voice calm, and turned to leave. That's when he added, almost casually, that he'd written to the plantation where her sister was held that the purchase was nearly complete. Her gratitude, he said, should match his generosity. That night, Phoebe lay awake until dawn. She knew the moment of reckoning was close. Nathaniel's control was tightening, his patience thinning. Once he took what he wanted, there would be no going back, only endless nights of violation, of being trapped in his power. And her sister would become the next victim. In that gray morning light, Phoebe made her choice. Nathaniel Green would not touch her. He would not own her. He would never lay hands on her sister. Whatever it cost, he had to be stopped. She began preparing that very day, moving through her tasks with quiet purpose. She gathered what she could, a rope from the carriage house, a kitchen knife hidden beneath her mattress, a tinderbox taken from the cellar. She saved scraps of food small enough to go unnoticed, but enough to sustain her if she needed to run or hide. Every move was deliberate. Every breath a step closer to what she knew must come. Phoebe spent the next days watching Nathaniel Green with the precision of a hunter, studying her prey. She noted how his habits followed a rhythm as predictable as the tide. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, he always drank more than usual. Wednesday nights especially, he'd send the servants to bed early, then linger in his study long past midnight, nursing wine and poring over his ledgers by candlelight. It was on one of those nights she realized that her chance would come. When the house was silent, when his guard was down, when no one else would hear. Each day she refined her plan, shaping it in her mind, until every detail felt etched in stone. During her trips to fetch wine, she began to study the cellar more carefully, the way the shadows shifted the corners that hid more than they revealed. She found a small window near ground level, too narrow for escape, but wide enough to let in a thin breath of night air. She discovered an old blanket tucked behind a stack of crates, still usable despite its musty smell. She memorized the placement of the wine racks, the strongest beams, and the darkest corners. The cellar was a place of fear, but it could also be something else, a trap. On a Tuesday evening in late February, Marcus came to repair a broken shutter. He saw the change in her immediately, the calm intensity in her eyes, the stillness that meant she had made a decision. He asked what she was planning, but she told him not to ask. If he didn't know, he couldn't be blamed. If he didn't know, he couldn't be forced to tell. He tried to argue, said he wanted to help, but Phoebe shook her head. "The best thing you can do for me," she whispered, "is to live. Remember me. Tell the truth if anyone ever asks." They stood close in the narrow hallway, the dim light casting their faces in soft gold. Marcus reached for her hand, then pulled her into a quick embrace, one stolen moment against a world built to deny them everything. "I love you," he whispered. Words he'd never dared to say before. She answered, "I know. And in another life I would have loved you openly." Then she was gone, slipping back downstairs, before anyone could notice. The next evening, Wednesday, March 2nd, 1842, unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play. Nathaniel dined alone and retired to his study as expected. He dismissed the other servants early, but told Phoebe to stay nearby. "I may need something later," he said. She knew exactly what he meant. At 10 o'clock, his voice called up the stairs, steady, commanding, certain of obedience. Phoebe's heart pounded as she descended, her hands steady only through sheer will. Under her apron, she carried a length of rope and a kitchen knife. She had oiled the cellar hinges earlier that day, so they would move without a sound. She had prayed quietly, fiercely, for strength, not mercy. When she entered his study, he was waiting. His coat was off his shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, a half-empty bottle of wine on the desk beside two glasses. The message was unmistakable. "We should talk," he said smoothly, smiling. "About your future, about your sister, about what's expected of you." He gestured toward the empty glass. "You should join me. Celebrate what's coming." Phoebe kept her eyes lowered. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "But I noticed earlier we're nearly out of your preferred wine. There are still some bottles of the French red in the cellar. I can fetch one for you." He looked pleased, certain she was finally submitting. "Very thoughtful," he said, taking the heavy keyring from its hook and handing her the cellar key. "Third rack from the front. 2 bottles." As she turned to go, he added, "Don't be long, we have things to discuss." His tone made her skin crawl, but she bowed her head and left the room. Downstairs the house was still and dim, the clock ticking loudly in the hall, the wind beginning to rise outside. Phoebe unlocked the cellar door and descended into the darkness, lighting a single candle. The shadows swayed across the brick walls as she moved. She selected 2 bottles from the rack, then paused, steadying her breath. This was it. 10 minutes, maybe less, before he came looking. She hid the rope and knife behind a pillar and pulled the old blanket over a stack of crates in the far corner. Small details, but she wanted the scene to tell its story long after she was gone. Then she looked toward the stairs and called out, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "Master Green," she said, "I think I hear something down here, a scratching sound behind the crates. Maybe rats." "I'm frightened to look." Silence. For a moment she thought he might not come. Then she heard his footsteps above, slow and heavy, and his muttered annoyance. The door opened, light spilling down the steps. "Rats," he scoffed, descending with a candle in hand. "You women always jumping at shadows?" Phoebe stood near the back wall, gesturing toward the dark corner. "It came from over there, sir." He walked past her, bending to inspect the crates. His back was turned, his attention fixed elsewhere. The moment arrived. Phoebe ran. She sprinted for the stairs, heart-hammering skirts rustling like a drumbeat. Nathaniel shouted behind her, realizing too late what was happening. She reached the top, slammed the heavy door shut, and twisted the key just as his shoulder hit the other side. The sound echoed like thunder through the house. For a breathless second she stood there, trembling, the key burning cold in her hand. Then came the pounding, furious, desperate, and his voice hoarse and raging, calling her name. "Open this door, girl. Do you hear me? Open it now." She stepped back, gasping for air, then turned and began to move with cold precision. She went first to his study, gathering what she could. A leather satchel filled with about $200 in cash and coins, a coat from his late wife's wardrobe, a pair of boots too large but strong, and the entire keyring from the wall. Then she climbed to her attic room and took the few possessions she owned, her comb, her Bible, her bundle of food and clothes. From the kitchen house she stole more bread, cheese, dried meat. Every sound from below, the pounding, the cursing, drove her faster. And through it all, an eerie calm settled over her. She had done it. She had trapped him, the man who believed he could own her. He was locked in the darkness where so many others had suffered before, and she was finally free, if only for a moment. Before she left, Phoebe returned to the cellar door one last time. His shouts were weaker now, his voice cracking from the strain, but the rage was still there. She untied her blue headscarf, the one she'd worn every day since arriving in Charleston, and fastened it around the iron key. She placed both on the floor where they would be found. A mark. A statement. Proof that Phoebe Carter had made her choice. Then she walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped into the storm. Rain lashed the streets, lightning lit the sky, and the wind tore at her skirts. Behind her, the grand house on Meeting Street stood in silence, except for the muffled, distant pounding of a man who had lost control of everything he thought he owned. Ahead of her lay the dark streets of Charleston and the unknown. But for the first time in her life, Phoebe Carter was the one holding the key. The storm roared in from the Atlantic like it had a score to settle, and Phoebe pulled the oversized coat tight, clutching her bundle, as she stepped into sheets of rain that turned streets into rivers. She had only one goal in mind, away from Nathaniel Green and the life he claimed to own. Charleston was empty and dark, the wind shoving her sideways as she moved toward the harbor by memory and lightning flashes. The waterfront was chaos, ropes, snapping masts, pitching crates, tumbling crews, yelling to save what they could. No captain was taking on a stranger in that madness. But the wreckage offered something else. She needed more than passage, a place to vanish. Farther along the older docks, where small boats had already been smashed to pieces, she slipped into a damaged warehouse that reeked of salt and fish and rot. It was barely dry, the walls shaking with each blast of wind. But it was shelter. She huddled in a corner, too wired to sleep, listening to waves crash and timbers groan, picturing Nathaniel raging in the cellar and praying Marcus would not suffer for what she had done. When the storm peaked, it felt like the world splitting open. Then slowly it let go, wind, easing from a scream to a moan, rain softening to a steady drum. By gray dawn, Charleston looked broken trees, uprooted shingles, scattered docks, ripped away boats piled like kindling. That ruin also gave her cover. With everyone counting losses and searching for neighbors, one tall woman in a muddy coat drew little notice. She walked with purpose through the debris, kept her head down, and reached a modest church where volunteers were sorting clothing and food. Acting on instinct, she stepped in to help and was put to work without questions beyond the obvious. All morning, she listened. By afternoon, the story was everywhere. Nathaniel Green found locked in his own cellar, furious and hoarse, his servant gone into the storm with some cash and a coat, a headscarf tied to the key like a calling card. Some demanded punishment. Others, speaking low, savored the humiliation of a man who thought he could not be touched. No name reached her ears, no posted reward yet, and the city's damage kept officials busy. As evening fell, the woman organizing relief asked if Phoebe had a place to sleep. She admitted she did not, and was offered a corner in the church basement in exchange for help. On that pallet among storm refugees, Phoebe let the truth settle in. She had slipped the first net, but safety was temporary. The city was small, the free black community watched. Without papers, she could not linger. North or west by road or ship, she would have to move soon and keep moving. Most people caught after a few days. The lucky few lived with a lifetime of looking over their shoulders. She decided again what she had decided the moment the cellar key turned. Better to risk everything for a real life than live without one. Over the next days, she worked quietly, kept her ears open, learned which roads were passable and which bridges had held, and heard of a small group of free families planning a trip inland toward Columbia to check on kin. In a city shaken to its core, with routines shattered and eyes pointed at the wreckage, Phoebe Carter used the only window fate had ever opened for her and began to chart the next move. Phoebe soon learned the port was coming back to life faster than anyone expected. Within days, sailors were repairing ships, merchants were shouting orders, and word spread that several vessels were preparing to sail north before the week's end. She listened carefully, storing every scrap of information, weighing each rumor for its usefulness. Then came the news she'd been dreading. Nathaniel Green had offered a reward, $100 for her capture. Descriptions of her were circulating now, mid-20s, tall, slim, educated enough to read numbers, skilled as a house servant. Wanted posters were being printed. Her face, her very existence, was about to become public property again. On the fourth day after the storm, Phoebe decided to take her chance. A merchant ship called the Meridian was set to sail for Baltimore in 2 days. The captain was hiring new crew to replace men injured in the storm or too shaken to sail again. Baltimore wasn't truly free. It straddled the line between north and south, but it was far enough to give her a fighting chance. From there she could keep moving, maybe to Philadelphia, maybe farther still. She knew the risks. She would have to talk her way aboard without papers, without friends, and without revealing who she really was. Using Nathaniel's money, Phoebe changed everything she could about her appearance. She traded her servant's dress for simple working clothes, took a bonnet that shadowed her face, and practiced walking with a slight limp to alter her posture. She crafted a story, a free woman who'd lost her papers in the storm traveling to Baltimore to join family after losing her home. The next evening, she made her way back to the harbor. The docks buzzed with activity again, cranes swinging ropes, creaking men shouting over the noise. The Meridian stood ready, a sturdy merchant ship built for long hauls. Phoebe watched from a distance until twilight deepened, studying the crew and the captain. A man in his 50s with sea-weathered skin and sharp assessing eyes. Then she gathered her courage and walked up the gangplank. A sailor eyed her suspiciously, but fetched the captain when she asked to speak with him. When he appeared, she told her story as calmly as she could, that she was a free woman from Charleston, her papers destroyed in the hurricane, needing to reach family in Baltimore. She had money for passage and was willing to work for her keep. The captain listened in silence, studying her face. He asked a few questions: where her family lived, what work she'd done, how much money she had. Phoebe answered smoothly, every lie anchored in enough truth to sound real. Finally, he said passage would cost $40 payment up front, and she could earn part of it back by working in the galley. Her hands trembled as she handed over the bills. The captain pocketed them, then fixed her with a long look. "I don't make it my business to ask questions," he said. "But if trouble follows you, I'll set you ashore at the nearest port." She nodded, understanding perfectly. He suspected she was running, but he didn't care as long as she didn't bring her trouble aboard his ship. Relief washed through her so hard she nearly staggered. She thanked him, left the deck, and hurried back through the lamplit streets toward the church. For the first time, freedom felt close enough to touch, and yet more dangerous than ever. She lay awake that final night in Charleston, listening to the soft breathing of the others in the church basement, thinking of Marcus, of her family, of the storm that had nearly killed her, but delivered her here. She thought of Nathaniel still locked in his cellar, and felt no guilt, only the quiet certainty that he had earned every second of his confinement. Before dawn, Phoebe gathered her bundle, left the church without a word, and walked through streets still slick from the storm. The city stirred with early laborers, enslaved people already at work in kitchens and courtyards, the cycle of servitude resuming as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Phoebe Carter was gone. She reached the docks as the first light crept over the horizon. The Meridian was alive with movement, sailors shouting, ropes creaking, cargo being hauled aboard. She blended into the bustle, climbed the gangplank again, and this time no one stopped her. She was just another traveler among dozens. As the ship pushed off with the rising tide, she stood at the rail, watching Charleston shrink into the mist. She felt no nostalgia, only fierce relief. The pink dawn shimmered over calm waters, and gulls circled above their cries, sharp and wild. 6 days later, the Meridian reached open waters, heading north through sun and spray. Phoebe kept to her work in the galley, quiet and steady, another nameless figure among sailors and merchants. On the third day, a passenger, a cotton trader bound for Philadelphia, asked if she'd heard about the slave woman who'd locked her master in his cellar during the great storm. He told the story with a smirk, calling it a bit of low-country madness, and asked what she thought of such defiance. Phoebe's heart clenched, but her face stayed composed. "I suppose she must have been desperate," she said softly. "People do desperate things when they've got nothing left." The man chuckled, agreed, and wandered off to boast to someone else. Phoebe turned back to her work, her pulse slowing. The sea stretched endless and unknowable beyond the rail, and for the first time, she dared to imagine a future not defined by fear. She didn't know what waited in Baltimore or beyond, but she was moving forward. She was free, if only for now, and that was enough. The voyage passed without incident, and on the 6th morning, Baltimore's harbor came into view, a gray sprawl of masts, smoke, and noise that made Charleston seem almost tranquil by comparison. It was a city of motion and industry, a place where ships came and went without pause, and men shouted orders over the clang of iron and the creak of rigging. Phoebe watched from the deck as the Meridian threaded its way toward the docks, feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. Baltimore meant possibility, but also exposure. It was another gamble in a life that had become one long wager against fate. When the ship finally docked, she waited until most passengers had disembarked before stepping onto the gangplank. She carried her small bundle against her chest, keeping her head down, her heart hammering. She had no plan, no allies, only the money she'd taken from Nathaniel Green and the instincts that had kept her alive this long. But she told herself what she had told herself since that night in Charleston. You have come too far to fail now. In the days that followed, Phoebe learned the streets of Baltimore the way a scout learns enemy terrain. She watched, listened, and mapped the rhythms of the city, where free black families lived, which neighborhoods were safest, which alleys were best avoided. She found a small boarding house run by a free black woman who rented her a room with no questions asked so long as the rent came on time. Within a week, Phoebe, now calling herself Sarah Wade, found work cleaning houses for white families. It was exhausting and paid little, but it bought her food, shelter, and anonymity. Baltimore was both freer and more perilous than Charleston. The black community here was larger, with churches, schools, and mutual aid societies that offered some measure of independence. But slavery still cast its shadow across every street. Slave catchers and informants prowled the docks and alleys, hunting for runaways to sell back south for a profit. Sarah lived each day in quiet vigilance, never staying in one place too long, never trusting too easily. She shortened her hair, changed her walk, adjusted her accent. Every detail of Phoebe Carter's life was sealed away like something dangerous. She became Sarah Wade, a free woman from Delaware, widowed by the storm, come to Baltimore to start again. And slowly, impossibly, the disguise began to feel real. Months passed. The raw fear faded to a constant background hum, a survival instinct that never fully quieted. Through whispers and travelers, she heard news from Charleston. Nathaniel Green had doubled the reward for her capture to $200, sending notices up and down the coast. Marcus had been questioned, but not punished. He'd claimed ignorance and been believed. And the story about Nathaniel buying her sister had been nothing but a lie, a cruel trick meant to keep Phoebe compliant. She had known it deep down, but hearing it confirmed turned her lingering guilt into pure, clean hatred. In the spring of 1843, a rumor reached her that Nathaniel Green was dead. A stroke, they said, collapsed in his office and gone before help arrived. Phoebe felt no triumph, only a strange, hollow quiet. She had dreamed of justice, of seeing him stripped of his power, made to face what he had done. Death was too easy. It robbed her of the reckoning she had long imagined. Still, she could breathe more freely, knowing he would never again send men hunting for her. Life in Baltimore settled into a rhythm. Sarah worked long hours, attended a church where black preachers wove messages of endurance and defiance into their sermons, and built quiet friendships with other women who carried their own unspoken histories. They shared advice about which households were safe to work, and which employers to avoid, which corners of the city allowed them to move with less scrutiny. It wasn't freedom, not truly, but it was a fragile kind of peace. Over the years, she moved northward Philadelphia, then New York. Each move giving her a little more distance from Charleston and the name Phoebe Carter. She worked as a maid, a laundress, a cook, jobs that paid little but asked fewer questions. And sometimes through the web of stories passed among black communities from city to city, she heard her own legend retold. They called the woman the Charleston Widow or the Storm's Ghost. Some said she'd poisoned her master before vanishing. Others claimed she'd stolen a ship and sailed it herself to freedom. A few insisted she'd been rescued by abolitionists and hidden in Canada. Each version was different, but the heart of it was the same: a woman who had refused to bow. Sarah never corrected anyone. She would sit quietly when the stories surfaced, folding laundry or stirring a pot of stew, and feel something between sorrow and pride. The truth was smaller, lonelier, but it had been enough to keep her alive. As the years passed and the nation edged toward war, life grew more dangerous again. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 stripped even the illusion of safety. Men and women who had lived free for decades were being dragged south in chains, sometimes on the thinnest of accusations. Sarah knew she could be next. Still, she did not run again. She had lived her life in motion, and now she wanted to live it on her own terms, even if those terms were fragile. Somewhere in Baltimore years earlier, she had buried Phoebe Carter. What remained, the woman the world knew as Sarah Wade, was someone entirely new, forged by fire and storm and defiance. And though she never said it aloud, she knew that what she had done in Charleston had rippled outward, carried in whispers and legends. It had become more than her story. It had become a warning and a promise that even in the darkest house behind the heaviest door, a woman might still find the strength to turn the key. By the time war erupted in 1861, Phoebe Carter, now long known as Sarah Wade, was living quietly in New York City. She worked as a laundress, mending and pressing the clothes of others, while keeping her own history folded deep within her like a secret she could never fully set down. She watched the nation split apart with a mix of hope and dread. The war might end slavery, but it might also destroy everything and everyone caught between the lines. She read what newspapers she could afford, listened to rumors and letters brought north by soldiers, and tried to imagine what freedom might actually mean when purchased with so much blood. When the Emancipation Proclamation was announced in 1863, Sarah read it aloud in her small rented room, the words strange and powerful on her tongue. She knew it was not the end of bondage. It applied only to the states still in rebellion. But it was a beginning. A breach in the wall that had stood her entire life. She let herself hope carefully, the way one handles something fragile and still too new to trust. 2 years later, in 1865, the war was over and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. Phoebe was 49 years old. For 23 years she had lived as a fugitive, defined by the fear of capture and the need to stay invisible. And now on paper, at least she was free. The realization felt unreal. Freedom had always been a direction, never a destination. It was strange to find herself in a world where the law no longer demanded her submission, though life quickly reminded her that law and justice were not the same thing. Freedom, she discovered, was complicated. The chains had been struck from the body, but new ones were being forged for the mind and the will. Former masters reinvented slavery through sharecropping, debt, peonage, and laws that punished black existence itself. Reconstruction promised transformation, but greed and hate turned it to dust. Phoebe saw it all unfold, the fleeting victories, the betrayals that followed the slow tightening of a new kind of cage. Still she endured. She grew old in a country struggling to define itself, living into her 70s, when so few who had been born enslaved ever reached such age. She never returned to Charleston. She never searched for her sisters, her mother, or Marcus. She carried them with her in memory, instead kept them alive in her heart, even as she accepted that the world had likely taken them long ago. In surviving, she honored them. Her life became their witness. By her later years, Sarah Wade had become almost a ghost. In her own story, a quiet, steady presence in a city too vast to notice one elderly black woman living in a small, rented room. She thought about legacy sometimes, about what it meant to leave behind something that mattered. She had no children, no fortune, no name that anyone would remember. But she had refused. She had resisted. She had chosen herself over her captor, defiance over despair. And that she decided would have to be enough. She died in 1897 at the age of 81, in a building that would be torn down within the year to make room for something newer, something indifferent. Her neighbors, who knew her only as Mrs. Wade, an old woman who worked hard and spoke little, divided her few possessions among themselves. None of them knew they were burying a legend. But her story had never really belonged to her alone. It had slipped free of her name decades earlier and taken root in the oral history of Black America. The tale of the woman who locked her master in his own cellar and vanished into a storm spread from Charleston to Baltimore, from Baltimore to Philadelphia, carried by whispers and sermons and songs. The details changed with every retelling. Some said she'd killed him, others that she'd fled to Canada. But the truth at its heart remained the same. She had said no. The house on Meeting Street survived the centuries. It became first a boarding house, then an office, and finally a museum. Tour guides told stories of its grand architecture and its wealthy owners, and eventually they mentioned, almost as an aside, the incident involving an enslaved woman who had once locked her master in the cellar. The tone was often amused, as if it were a curiosity, not an act of rebellion. The cellar itself remained unchanged, the stone steps, the thick oak door, the rusted iron rings on the wall. Preservationists debated whether to remove the chains, but ultimately kept them, labeling them historical artifacts. The headscarf Phoebe had left behind, blue and weathered, tied around the cellar key, survived as well. It passed from one owner to another, sometimes displayed, sometimes forgotten. Then during the civil rights movement, it was rediscovered. Scholars and activists recognized it for what it was, a relic of resistance, a symbol of refusal. Historians searched for the woman behind it. They found fragments, an auction record, a newspaper clipping, a rumor of a woman named Sarah Wade in Baltimore. But the full truth remained elusive, just as Phoebe had intended. Even now, no one can say for certain what became of her. Whether she died quietly in New York, as the records suggest, or lived on under another name. What can be said with absolute certainty is that on a stormy night in 1842, an enslaved woman in Charleston took hold of a heavy iron key, locked her master behind a door, and walked into the raging wind. That moment became legend. It became proof that defiance was possible, that even in the heart of oppression, someone could stand up and say, "Enough." Phoebe Carter's true legacy was not her escape, but her refusal to be broken. She reminded the world that freedom is not something granted, it is something claimed again and again, no matter the cost. And sometimes when the museum on Meeting Street is silent, staff claim to hear it, the echo of a door slamming shut, the sharp turn of a key, the sound of a choice being made, the sound of a woman becoming free.